The Texas sun rose slow and golden across the horizon, spilling light over rolling hills and endless stretches of sagebrush. The morning air was sharp with the scent of mesquite, carrying a stillness that seemed almost reverent, as if even the land itself knew this was a day that held meaning. Inside the modest ranch house, Lila Mae Carson stood before a mirror, smoothing the white fabric of her wedding dress with trembling hands. Her reflection showed a young woman of 21, her hazel eyes wide with both joy and nerves. She wasn't a woman given to vanity. Most days her face was sun-kissed from hours of work outdoors, her hair tucked beneath a hat. But today, with a veil pinned to her dark curls, she looked every bit the bride she had once dreamed of becoming as a child. Behind her stood her father, John Carson, weathered by years under the sun, his shoulders broad and hands scarred from rope burns and cattle work. His eyes, though shadowed with age and loss, held a softness when they rested on his daughter. For John, this day was more than just a wedding. It was a promise fulfilled, a chance for his daughter to have the stability and happiness her mother never got to see. "You look just like her," he said quietly, his voice rough but full of pride. "Your mama would have been so proud." Lila's throat tightened. She never liked to cry, especially not today, but the words brought tears to the surface. Her mother had passed when she was only 6, taken too soon by an illness no doctor could cure. Since then, John had raised Lila alone, calling her his mama's angel every time she stumbled or triumphed, as if the phrase could tie her to the mother she lost. "Papa," she whispered, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "Do you think she's watching?" John nodded without hesitation. "She's right here, darling. Always has been. Always will be." The ranch house buzzed with quiet preparation. Neighbors had brought food, her dress had been sewn by an aunt, and the local preacher was already waiting at the chapel on the hill. But in that moment, everything faded except the bond between father and daughter. John adjusted her veil, his rough fingers surprisingly gentle. "I reckon today's the start of forever for you," he said. "The kind your mama always wanted us to have. Don't you forget, you're walking into a good life, and you deserve every bit of it." Lila smiled through the shimmer of tears, her heart swelling with hope. She believed him. She believed in the love that waited for her at the chapel, in the vows that would be spoken under God's eye, and in the promise of forever with Daniel Hayes, the man who swore he'd never let her down. With the sun climbing higher and her father's arm steady at her side, Lila Mae Carson stepped out of the ranch house, ready to begin what she thought would be the happiest day of her life. The small white chapel perched atop a hill like a beacon, its wooden walls glowing softly under the morning sun. The dusty road leading up to it bore the marks of wagon wheels and hoof prints, a testament to the generations who had walked its path before. Lila Mae Carson's heart pounded in her chest as she and her father approached, her white gown brushing the ground, her veil catching the wind like a fluttering promise of tomorrow. Inside, the pews were filling with townsfolk who had known Lila all her life. Old Mrs. Hargrove clutched her parasol, whispering blessings to the young bride. The local blacksmith, a burly man with soot still under his nails, offered a nod of approval. Even children peeked between pews, wide-eyed at the sight of Lila in her wedding dress. Everyone carried the same hope, the hope that this marriage would bring joy not just to the bride and groom, but to the whole community. John Carson's eyes swept over the gathering, lingering on familiar faces that had shared in both his grief and his triumphs. Raising a daughter alone had not been easy, and the weight of the past 21 years rested on his shoulders today. He had known poverty, heartbreak, and loneliness, but standing here now, he felt a rare swell of pride. Lila was radiant, strong, and kind, everything her mother had been, yet entirely her own. "She looks just like her mama," whispered an elderly neighbor, tears pricking her eyes. "Your mama would have been over the moon." John's hand tightened around Lila's. "I reckon she's smiling down on us," he murmured. "You're her angel, just like always." Lila felt a shiver of warmth at his words. Her mother's absence had always been a shadow over her life, yet here, surrounded by family, friends, and the love her father had nurtured so carefully, that shadow seemed to shrink. Today wasn't just about a union between two people. It was a chance to honor her mother's memory and to carry forward the legacy of love and resilience that defined the Carson family. The preacher, a kind man with graying hair and a voice that carried both authority and comfort, stepped to the front. His gaze swept the chapel, pausing on Lila, whose fingers nervously clutched the edges of her veil. "We are gathered here today," he began, "to witness a bond of hearts, a joining not just of bodies, but of lives, families, and the promise of the future." Every word echoed through Lila's chest, a steady rhythm that matched the pulse of hope growing inside her. She looked to her father, standing tall with a mix of pride and quiet anxiety, and felt the same steady reassurance she always had when life seemed uncertain. As the doors closed behind the last of the guests, Lila took a deep breath. She was ready to step into a future she had imagined countless times. The sun outside gleamed over the chapel roof, as though blessing her courage, her faith, and her family's enduring hope. In that moment, nothing else mattered, only the promise of forever and the love that had carried her to this day. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours inside the little chapel on the hill. The sun had risen higher, casting long, warm beams through the stained glass windows, illuminating the wooden pews and the anxious faces gathered within. Lila May. Carson sat at the front, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart a mix of excitement and growing unease. Her father, John Carson, stood beside her, a pillar of calm, though the tension in his jaw betrayed his worry. Guests began to murmur softly, glancing toward the doors at the far end of the chapel, expecting the familiar figure of Daniel Hayes, the young rancher Lila had promised to marry. The townsfolk had watched the couple grow together over the years. Daniel, tall and strong, with the easy confidence of someone used to the open range, and Lila, spirited and kind, whose heart seemed as vast as the Texas sky. Everyone knew this. Day was meant to be a celebration of love, yet a creeping sense of uncertainty began to ripple through the crowd. Time moved differently when you were waiting for something, or someone, essential. Lila's chest tightened with each passing moment. She whispered a quiet prayer under her breath, imagining Daniel riding up the dusty road any second, tipping his hat with that crooked smile she had always adored. But the chapel doors remained stubbornly closed. Her father's hand rested gently on her shoulder. "He'll be here, darlin'," he said, though his voice lacked the usual certainty. "He's probably just running late. These things happen." Lila nodded, forcing a small smile, but inside a cold knot of worry had begun to form. She could feel the eyes of the townspeople on her, their whispered speculations barely restrained. Some faces showed concern, others polite patience. Yet, the weight of expectation pressed heavily upon her. She had imagined this moment for years, the wedding bells, the vows, the embrace of a life shared with someone she loved. And now the silence was louder than any words she had ever heard. She tried to steady her breathing, clinging to her father's presence. "Maybe he got held up with the cattle drive or the weather on the plains," she murmured, grasping for any explanation that would make sense, that would keep hope alive. But the clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching longer than the last. The murmurs of the guests grew more audible, the shifting of feet a gentle drumbeat of doubt. Lila's stomach twisted. Something wasn't right, though she needed to believe it was only a minor delay. Her gaze fell on the door again, her heart aching with anticipation. Each creak of the hinges would have made her leap with joy, if only it were Daniel. But the chapel remained empty at the end of the aisle, the silence growing heavier, almost tangible, as if the very air was holding its breath, waiting to shatter her world. It was in that still, heavy moment that Lila first felt the shadow of fear creep into her chest, the faintest whisper that perhaps today forever might not come after all. The chapel had fallen silent, a stillness so heavy it pressed against Lila Mae Carson's chest. She sat at the front, her hands clenching the edges of her gown as hope began to fray like the worn laces on her boots. Her father, John Carson, stood rigid beside her, his broad frame unmoving, though the lines around his eyes betrayed his unease. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the chapel doors, as if the answer to Lila's prayers would finally arrive. And then a rider appeared. Not Daniel, not the man she had promised to spend her life with, but someone else entirely. Dust clung to his boots and coat, his face grave and tight. He dismounted with urgency, holding a folded piece of paper in one hand. The townsfolk whispered among themselves, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong. The man approached John, and Lila slowly. "Mr. Carson?" he asked, voice careful, almost apologetic. I have a message from Daniel Hayes." Lila's stomach sank. Her heart pounded as she reached out, desperate to hear the words she had been waiting for all morning. Daniel's message, she told herself, would be a simple explanation. Delayed, detained, something, anything, to ease the fear gnawing at her. But when the paper was handed to her, she felt the weight of it like a stone pressing against her chest. She unfolded it with trembling hands and read the scrawled words. "I can't do this. I'm sorry. I won't be coming. Forgive me." The words blurred through her vision, and the chapel seemed to tilt around her. The townsfolk froze. Some clutching each other, others staring in stunned silence. Lila's knees weakened, and she sank into her father's side, her veil hiding the tears that threatened to spill. John's hand was on her back in a strong, steadying motion, but even he could not shield her entirely from the heartbreak. "Darlin'," he whispered, his voice low, rough with emotion. "It's all right. You'll get through this. You always do." She shook her head, unable to speak. The future she had imagined, the vows, the ring, the life with Daniel, was gone in an instant. The chapel, once filled with hope and laughter, now echoed with the harsh reality of abandonment. The guests shifted uncomfortably, some offering, murmured words of comfort, others unsure how to face the rawness of grief. For a long moment, Lila simply sat, her mind spinning. The man she had trusted, loved, and believed in had left her at the altar, leaving only a few words on a scrap of paper. The world felt suddenly cruel, and the promise of forever she had clung to was now nothing more than a fragile illusion. Her father lifted her gently, carrying her from the chapel despite the murmurs around them. "You're still my mama's angel," he said, his voice unwavering even as his own heart ached. "Nothing's changed that. Not ever." In that shattering moment, Lila Mae Carson realized that life could turn in an instant, and that the future she had imagined might not come to pass. But in her father's embrace, she found the first flicker of a different kind of hope, one that wouldn't depend on anyone but herself and the people who truly loved her. The world outside the chapel seemed unusually bright, almost mocking, as John Carson gently carried his sobbing daughter down the dusty path toward the ranch. Lila Mae's veil clung to her tear-streaked cheeks, her gown dragging over the dirt, as if the earth itself wanted to slow her steps. Her father's strong arms were the only shelter she could cling to, a shield against the humiliation, shock, and despair that weighed so heavily on her small frame. "I'm sorry, Papa," Lila murmured, her voice barely audible between sobs. I don't understand. Why would he leave me? John shook his head slowly, his weathered face taut with pain. Some folks just ain't ready for the kind of love that lasts, darling, he said softly. That don't mean you're any less worthy. You hear me? Any less worthy. Lila's tears fell freely now, soaking into the front of her gown. She felt like the sky had opened and poured its grief directly onto her shoulders, and all she could do was cling to the only constant left in her life. Her father. They walked in silence for a while, the only sounds the crunch of boots on dirt and the distant lowing of cattle in the fields. Back at the ranch, the familiar sights, the weathered fence, the corral, the barn where she had spent countless hours helping her father, offered a small measure of comfort. It was here, amidst the life her mother had once shared, and her father had preserved, that Lila felt safe enough to finally let the storm inside her rage. John sat her down on the wooden steps of the porch, brushing a hand through her tangled curls. Look at me, Angel, he said, using the words he had said since she was a child. You're still your mama's angel, and angels, well, they don't disappear just because someone else fails to see their worth. The words, familiar yet powerful, began to anchor Lila's spinning heart. She buried her face in her father's chest, inhaling the smell of leather, tobacco, and sun-baked wood, a scent that had always meant home. In his arms, the pain was still there, but it was quieter, softened by love and reassurance. You raised me to be strong, Papa, she whispered between shudders. I just feel so lost. And you are strong, Lila May, he said firmly. Stronger than anyone you'll ever meet. Life will try to knock you down, sometimes in ways you can't even imagine, but you'll get back up. You always do. And I'll be right here, every step of the way. She looked up at him, the corners of her lips trembling as the first flicker of hope appeared. Her father's presence reminded her that even when promises were broken, love remained. Not the fleeting, fragile kind from a groom who couldn't keep his word, but the unwavering, enduring love of a parent who would never abandon her. For the first time that day, Lila May allowed herself to breathe. The future might have shifted, and the dream she had envisioned at the altar was gone, but she was not broken. She had her father, her home, and the resilience that had been woven into her since the day she was born. And in that moment, wrapped in her father's arms, she realized that some promises, the ones that truly mattered, were already kept. Tambay, Carson Ranch had always been a place of refuge, but eventually, life demanded that Lila May step beyond its fences and face the world again. Days after the wedding that never was, the town seemed to whisper at every turn, and every glance carried judgment, or worse, pity. The little grocery store, the blacksmith shop, even the church pews she had once sat in proudly, now felt laden with expectation, the invisible eyes of the townsfolk tracking her every step. Lila walked slowly along the main street, her hat pulled low against the sun and against the stairs she could feel pressing into her back. She heard snatches of conversation as she passed. Did you hear about Daniel? Ah, poor girl, left standing at the altar. Each whisper sank into her chest like a stone, and though she lifted her chin, the weight of their words pressed her forward with difficulty. Her father had tried to prepare her, though he knew nothing could truly shield her from the sting of the world's scrutiny. People will talk, Lila May, John Carson had warned, resting a hand on her shoulder. Some with kindness, some with jealousy, some just because they can't mind their own business. But their words, they don't define you. Never have, never will. She clutched her father's words like a talisman as she approached Mrs. Hargrove's general store. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and old wood greeted her, but even here, she felt the curious eyes of neighbors turning toward. Her. Mrs. Hargrove, however, offered a warm smile and a gentle nod. "Morning, darlin'," she said softly, lowering her voice. "Don't mind the gossip. You've got a strong heart, and everyone's got their own mess to deal with." Even small acts of kindness like these reminded Lila that not everyone in town was unkind. There were those who genuinely cared, who had been watching her not with judgment but with concern, ready to lend a hand or a comforting word. Slowly, she began to remember that the world wasn't only a place of whispers and scorn. It could also hold support, understanding, and compassion. Yet the sting of Daniel's betrayal lingered. Every familiar face was a reminder of the wedding. That should have been every empty glance, a subtle echo of a dream that had been stolen. It was a delicate balance, acknowledging her pain while refusing to let it define her. By the end of the day, Lila returned to the ranch exhausted, but a little stronger. She had learned that facing the town wasn't just about enduring their whispers. It was about asserting her presence despite them. With her father waiting on the porch, she felt the unspoken assurance that no matter what the town said, she wasn't alone. In the quiet twilight, as the wind rustled through the mesquite trees, Lila May realized that while some wounds took time to heal, courage was forged in the act of standing tall, even when the world seemed determined to knock her down. She wasn't merely a girl left waiting at the altar, she was her mama's angel, and that meant something far stronger than anyone's judgment could ever diminish. Back at the Carson Ranch, life had a rhythm that the town could never offer. The early mornings, the warm sun on her back, the smell of hay and leather, it all had a grounding effect on Lila May Carson. After the heartbreak of being left at the altar, she found solace not in words or sympathy, but in the steady, honest labor that defined ranch life. Each task, no matter how small, became a step toward reclaiming herself. She rose with the sun, her father already tending to the horses in the corral. "Morning, darlin'," he called, tipping his hat with a faint smile. "Ready to start another day?" Lila returned the smile, faint but genuine. "As ready as I'll ever be, Papa." She threw herself into the chores, feeding the cattle, checking fences, mending broken gates. Her hands, calloused from years of helping her father, moved with efficiency and purpose. With every swing of the hammer, every bale of hay lifted, she felt a little of the grief ease from her chest. The ranch didn't ask for explanations or apologies. It asked only for effort and attention, and that simplicity was a balm to her wounded spirit. John watched her work quietly, his heart swelling with pride. He knew she was hurting, and he didn't rush her through it. Healing wasn't about forgetting, he had learned, but about rediscovering strength in familiar places. "You've got the heart of a Carson, Lila May," he said one afternoon, leaning against the fence as she guided a young colt back to its stall. "That heart's bigger than any hurt. Remember that." Evenings on the ranch were quiet but comforting. Lila and her father would sit on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The world seemed to slow at those moments, letting her breathe and reflect. She began to write again in her journal, capturing not only her sorrow, but also the small victories. The fence repaired, the horse trained, the herd counted without issue. Each page became a testament to her resilience. Neighbors occasionally stopped by with supplies or conversation, and though Lila initially felt guarded, she discovered that genuine kindness still existed outside the walls of the ranch. Small gestures, a basket of fresh eggs, a visit from a friend, a shared laugh, reminded her that life hadn't stopped, even though her heart felt fractured. With each passing week, the ranch became more than a place of work. It became a sanctuary. The land, the animals, her father's unwavering support, and the simplicity of routine helped her reclaim a sense of purpose. She was no longer merely the girl left waiting at the altar. She was learning to stand tall again, to define herself not by the betrayal she had suffered, but by the strength she had always carried. By the time the days began to grow warmer and the fields greener, Lila Mae Carson felt a spark she hadn't felt in months, a quiet hope that life, though unpredictable, could still hold beauty, love, and even unexpected joy. Healing, she realized, wasn't a single moment, but a series of small, steadfast steps, and she was taking them one by one on the land that had always been her home. It was late one afternoon when a rider appeared on the dusty road leading to the Carson Ranch. Lila Mae Carson, busy tending the barn, barely noticed at first, but when the figure dismounted and approached with a quiet confidence, she paused, wiping sweat from her brow and sizing him up. He was tall, lean, and carried the look of someone accustomed to the open range, yet there was something unassuming in the way he carried himself, a calm patience that made the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. "Evening," he said, tipping his hat politely. "Name's Colt Mercer. I'm passing through. Thought I'd see if you needed any help with your horses or your herd." Lila's first instinct was caution. She had been hurt, left standing at the altar, and the world still felt fragile around her. But there was no arrogance in his tone, no expectation, just a quiet offer of assistance. "We're managing, thanks," she replied, her voice steady, though curiosity tugged at her. "But if you're willing to help, there's always work to be done." Colt nodded, removing his hat and dusting it off with care. "I reckon I can do that." Over the next few days, he became a steady presence at the ranch. He didn't force conversation or try to probe into Lila's past. He simply worked alongside her and her father, fixing fences, tending horses, and offering practical advice. Lila found his company unexpectedly comforting. There was no pressure, no expectations, just quiet companionship and shared labor, the kind of bond that allowed wounds to begin mending without anyone having to speak them aloud. One afternoon, as they repaired a corral near the edge of the property, Colt handed Lila a hammer. "You got a strong arm, Miss Carson," he said with a grin. "Seems like you've been handling more than just wood and nails lately." She glanced at him, caught off guard by the gentle acknowledgement. "You could say that," she replied, softly, feeling the tiniest spark of warmth in her chest. John watched from the porch, observing the subtle change in his daughter. For the first time in weeks, she laughed freely, her eyes catching the sunlight as she worked. It was a laugh not of distraction, but of relief, a sign that her heart was beginning to heal. Colt didn't rush or push. He never mentioned Daniel or the chapel on the hill. He simply showed up, offered his time and skills, and respected the quiet space Lila needed to rebuild her life. His kindness was steady, almost unremarkable in its simplicity. But that was exactly what made it powerful. By the end of the week, Lila found herself looking forward to his presence, not because she expected romance or drama, but because she had discovered a new sense of trust, and perhaps the first flicker of hope that connection could exist again. The ranch, the work, and the stranger's steady support reminded her that the world could still hold unexpected kindness, and that maybe, just maybe, her heart wasn't finished with hope yet. In Colt Mercer's quiet, patient way, Lila Mae Carson began to understand that healing didn't require grand gestures. Sometimes it simply came from someone willing to stand beside you while the world slowly righted itself. Weeks turned into months, and the Carson Ranch settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and renewing. Lila Mae Carson moved through her days with a quiet confidence, her hands calloused from labor, her heart steadily mending, and her spirit rooted deeply in the life she had always known. The heartbreak of the chapel, the whispers of the town, and the betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable now lingered only as shadows she had learned to navigate, not as chains that bound her. She rose early, as always, watching the sun paint the horizon in fiery gold and amber. The scent of dew on hay and the soft lowing of cattle greeted her like old friends. Each morning she reminded herself that this land, these routines, and the enduring love of her father were constants she could rely upon. Strength, she realized, was not something she had been given. It had always been cultivated, growing quietly in the soil of her roots. Her father, John Carson, often watched her from the porch, tipping his hat with pride. "You've grown strong, Lila Mae," he said one morning as she returned from feeding the cattle. "Stronger than I've ever seen. Your mama would be proud too, you know." Lila smiled, the warmth of the words anchoring her. She thought of her mother not with sorrow, but with gratitude, for the life she had begun, for the values she had instilled through her memory, and for the love her father had nurtured in her absence. Being her mama's angel was no longer just a comforting phrase. It had become a guiding principle, a reminder that she could carry love, loss, and hope together without being diminished by any of them. Colt Mercer remained a steady, reassuring presence on the ranch. He didn't need to speak of the past or promise a future. His quiet companionship allowed Lila to focus on the present, on the tangible things she could touch, fix, and nurture. Slowly, she found herself laughing again, planning small joys, and discovering that life could offer gentle surprises without the threat of heartbreak lurking behind them. Evenings on the porch became a time of reflection and connection. Lila would watch the stars emerge one by one, thinking about the lessons she had learned, resilience, patience, and the understanding that her worth was never dependent on another's promises. Her father's steady hand and her own determination had cultivated a strength that could weather any storm. By the time the fields turned green with spring, Lila Mae Carson had transformed her pain into power. She no longer defined herself by the groom who had abandoned her or by the whispers of the town. Instead, she stood rooted in the ranch, in her family, and in the life she was actively shaping. In her heart, she knew that while the past had left its mark, it was her choices, her resilience, and her connections to those who truly loved her that would determine her future. Lila Mae Carson had found her wings, not in the arms of another, but in the strength of her roots, and in that realization, she discovered a freedom and peace she had never known before. The first light of morning spilled over the horizon in soft streaks of pink and gold, casting the Carson ranch in a warm, hopeful glow. Lila Mae Carson stood on the porch, the breeze tugging gently at her hair and dress. For the first time in months, she breathed deeply, savoring the crisp air and the quiet sounds of the waking ranch, the low murmur of cattle, the distant whinny of a horse, and the whisper of wind through the mesquite trees. Her father, John Carson, leaned against the railing beside her, tipping his hat with a smile that carried pride, relief, and an unspoken understanding. "You've come a long way, Angel," he said softly, his eyes scanning the fields where she had poured her heart into work and healing. "Your mama would have been proud, and I reckon so am I." Lila smiled, the memory of her mother no longer a shadow but a warm light guiding her steps. She thought of the chapel, the heartbreak, and the long days of doubt and whispered judgment. Each step had been hard, each wound deep, but they had also taught her something invaluable, that her worth was not tied to the promises of another, nor to the fleeting approval of the town. Her strength, her resilience, and her compassion had always been her own. Colt Mercer approached from the barn, carrying a feed bucket and offering a quiet nod. Lila acknowledged him with a smile, feeling a sense of ease she hadn't known in months. There was no rush, no pressure, just the gentle, steady presence that reminded her that life could be gentle, even after betrayal. She realized that she didn't need to cling to someone else to find joy. She only needed people who respected her strength and shared her values. John cleared his throat, drawing her attention. "It's a new day, Lila May. And you? Well, you've got your wings now. You're ready for whatever comes next." The words resonated deeply. For so long, she had felt like a bird trapped in a storm, buffeted by winds beyond her control. But now, standing on the porch of the ranch that had nurtured her through every hardship, she felt a lightness in her chest, a freedom she hadn't dared to hope for. She could face the world without fear because she had learned to trust in herself, her family, and the life she had built from the ground up. As the sun rose higher, painting the sky with vibrant hues, Lila swung into her saddle, the horse beneath her steady and strong. She felt the rhythm of the land, the heartbeat of the ranch, and the enduring love of her father carrying her forward. Today was not about loss or betrayal. It was about resilience, hope, and the promise of a life fully embraced. With one last glance at her father, she tipped her hat in a silent thank you and rode toward the open fields. The wind tugged at her veil, lifting it like wings catching the sun. Lila May Carson, her mama's angel, was no longer left waiting at the altar. She was moving forward, strong, free, and ready to write the next chapter of her life under the endless welcoming sky.